Great, wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. It's really great to be with you today. It's a real honor to speak on this global psychology series about the work that we've been doing in my lab for about the past 11 years or so. But before we dive into that, I want to go back to sort of where it all started for me and also for Dr. Monica Stoyak, who's here on our call as well. And I'm very gracious for the invitation that she extended to me. This goes all the way back to grad school for us. So when we were both studying for our PhD at the University of Georgia in the same lab, this was actually the final dinner that some of us had in that lab before I moved on for postdoc, and I believe Monica was getting ready to move on to her internship or possibly postdoc. So this was just a nice little opportunity for us. We've changed quite a bit over the years, obviously, but it's really kind of interesting to see that this is now 12 years later or so, 13 years later, and we're still at this thing that we call psychology. So that's pretty cool. I also want to start by acknowledging the fact that the majority of the work that I'm going to be presenting today has been conducted in collaboration or being led by my trainees. So that includes graduate students as well as undergraduate students and postdoc fellows at the University of Kansas, as well as my previous faculty position, which was at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And so you'll see their pictures pop up throughout the talk today, and I'll be sure to emphasize when the work that I'm presenting is their science that I'm just very happy to share with you as well. So the topic for today is going to be something that was mentioned maybe a little different from what you've had in this series, but it's going to be behavioral economic approaches to addictive disorders. So I'm going to start with just setting some broad definitions and background on what we mean by behavioral economics, and with a main emphasis on what I and others refer to as contextual influences on behavior and choice. And we'll explain what we mean by contextual influences in a moment. Then I'm going to walk you through a series of laboratory and crowdsourcing studies of a specific type of behavioral economic process known as substance demand. So we're going to look at studies of substance-related cues. We're going to look at studies of next-day responsibilities as examples of how we can apply behavioral economics to study contextual influences on choice. We'll have a brief detour into the idea of neuroeconomics. So another major part of my lab is to do functional brain imaging studies of people with various addictive disorders and people who use various substances. So I'll share a little bit of some of that work to give you just a brief taste of what that work involves. And then we'll have some time at the end for a brief summary and any questions you may have. So to get us started, the field of behavioral economics may be new to some of you on the call today. And it really is an integration of principles from psychology, microeconomics, and operant learning theory. And we're interested in studying how people make choices. So people's choices about their resources that they have are influenced by the price or the cost of various alternatives. It can be impacted by the delay to receipt of a reward or a delay to receipt of some outcome. Can also be influenced by the availability and the value that you place on different alternatives in your environment. So we don't make choices in a vacuum. We make choices when they're in the presence of other alternative activities or other reinforcers. So behavioral economics tries to incorporate some of these sort of contextual or price or delay-based influences on choice. And we have brought this all together into what's known as the reinforcer pathology model of addiction, which suggests that people that have addiction or use substances have an underlying difference in the way that they gain reinforcement from those substances relative to everything else. And this was an influential model proposed by Warren Bickel in 2011, and it has been advanced through a couple different iterations over the years. When we think about addiction, we're often concerned about three things. The first is known as substance demand, which is going to be our focus today. It's primarily substance demand. We also are interested in things known as delay discounting, which you may have heard of. It's essentially preferences for smaller immediate rewards relative to larger delayed rewards. I've done quite a bit of work in that area, and a number of other people have as well. And then the final area of behavioral economics, which we're not really going to touch on today, is this idea of proportionate substance-related reinforcement. So people who use substances or have a substance use disorder will often obtain more reinforcement from the substance or substance-related activities or behaviors relative to everything else in their environment. But the focus today is on substance demand. So when we think about demand, it is, as the name implies, supply and demand, law of demand. It's the same basic concept as those general economic principles. We're talking about a behavioral economic index of the relative reinforcing value of a commodity. So in other words, we're looking at the quantitative relationship between the consumption of some good or some commodity and its cost and its price. Typically, we think about the cost as being monetary. So how much would you consume this item or this commodity if it costs a certain amount of money? But it doesn't have to be money. It could be effort. It could be time. It could be any number of things that incur a cost to obtaining that substance. Traditionally, this was done with human operant paradigms where you can imagine a parallel to a laboratory animal where they might press a lever according to some ratio of reinforcement, schedule of reinforcement. That is somewhat difficult to do in humans because we don't usually have the same apparatus to do that. It's time intensive, it's cost intensive. And so what colleagues in behavioral economics have developed are what are known as hypothetical purchase tasks, where it's the same basic principle of an operant choice task, but we do it using these hypothetical questions. So I'm going to walk you through an example of one for alcohol. So the alcohol purchase task was developed in 2006 by Murphy and McKillop, and it essentially asks participants to self-report how many drinks would they consume if they cost a certain amount of money. So how many standard drinks would you consume or standard units of alcohol would you consume if they were free? And then we systematically increase the price. So anywhere from 25 cents up to $20 or even higher prices depending on the study. And that allows us to plot consumption as a function of price, which you'll see in a moment. Typically with these choice tasks, we're asking people to think about their typical drinking situation. So a typical evening in which you might consume alcohol or consume other substances. But we can also do more state-based purchase tasks, where we're asking people not about their typical evening or a typical drinking episode, but we want to know right now. So based on how you're feeling in this moment, right now, when I'm asking you these questions, how many drinks would you consume? So that gives us a really powerful tool to look at moment to moment or state-based fluctuations in how much somebody values alcohol. And it could be that in certain circumstances or certain situations, people overvalue alcohol. In other situations, they undervalue alcohol. And that might tell us something about the development of an alcohol use disorder or a substance use disorder. When we obtain data from these measures, our goal is to plot something called a demand curve. So on a demand curve, we're going to plot consumption, in this case, the number of drinks, as a function of its price. And we typically plot the price as a log scale for proportionality. And so what we end up with is a demand curve that looks something like this. So this could be one person, or this could be a group of individuals. So we could be plotting means here or medians. In this case, this is a person that exhibits somewhat modest demand, about 6 drinks when the drinks are free. There's a period where they decelerate or their consumption goes down, and then eventually they reach 0. And if you compare that to a second person or a second group, that they're consuming 10 drinks at these lower prices and tending to consume even at higher prices relative to the gray curve, we would say that this person or this group exhibits higher demand. We typically don't stop with just the raw consumption values. We usually take these curves and we generate a number of parameters known as demand indices. So the first one we often look at is what's called intensity. Some people call this Q0. It's essentially the consumption of the commodity when it's free. So if you think about unrestricted consumption, how much are you willing to drink or use cannabis or smoke cigarettes, whatever it may be? In this case, we have a difference of about 4 standard drinks or 4 standard units. Breakpoint is at the other end of the curve. That is where the consumption essentially reaches zero. And the individual or the groups as a whole are saying that price is too much. I'm not willing to consume anymore. Another parameter is known as elasticity of demand. This is somewhat complicated in the way that it's calculated, but it essentially reflects the proportionate slope of the curve. So does the curve decelerate relatively steep, or is it a relatively shallow curve? And so we can look at this alpha parameter known as elasticity. There's two more parameters to mention. If you take the consumption value on the y-axis and multiply it times the price on the x-axis, you can get an expenditure curve that looks something like this. So this is the same data, just converted into expenditure. And that allows us to look at a parameter known as Omax. So Omax essentially is the maximum expenditure that somebody is willing to spend on this commodity, whatever it may be. And then a final parameter that we look at is known as Pmax, which is the price at which Omax occurs. We don't look at that one as much as the other parameters, but the main ones are intensity, breakpoint, and Omax. So why are these purchase tasks, these alcohol purchase tasks, why are they useful? They're useful because we can meaningfully differentiate participants based on their level of alcohol consumption or their level of alcohol problem severity. So in the top left here, you're seeing two different demand curves, the unfilled squares and the filled squares, as a function of heavy drinking versus social drinking. So in this case, the heavy drinkers are the filled data points. You can see they're reporting consuming significantly more drinks across the prices relative to the social drinkers. On the bottom left, this is more data, this time looking at alcohol use disorder severity. So the filled squares, filled circles here are the upper 25% of severity compared to the lower quartile of severity. It's a relatively modest difference, but you'll note that it's in logarithmic scale on the y. So it's actually a larger difference than it may appear. And then on the right side of the slide, this is a large study by Berthollet and colleagues, again, looking at severity of alcohol use disorder. What we see is that it may be a little hard to disentangle, but essentially as the alcohol use disorder becomes more severe, the demand curves stack on each other. So it does appear to meaningfully differentiate people based on their level of drinking and their level of alcohol use disorder severity. My team has extended this a bit over the past decade or so to look at a few different specific populations of participants. So one of the areas that we were interested in for a while, this is one of my former graduate students, Vanessa Morris, and she was interested in people that report using multiple substances. So we often find that people don't just engage in one type of substance use. They might be using cannabis and alcohol, or smoking cigarettes and alcohol, or some combination. And so she did a study where she looked at participants that reported co-use of alcohol and cannabis. And in this case, the individuals that were the co-users are the higher, the elevated demand in this case across pretty much every price. On the bottom, my lab also looked at cigarette smokers who were drinkers versus non-smokers. And in this case, the smokers showed elevated demand relative to people who were just drinkers only and didn't report smoking. We've also extended this to look at a specific type of high-risk behavior, which is substance-impaired driving. This is a former graduate student of mine, Dr. Harry Patel, did a series of studies looking at alcohol-impaired driving on the top and cannabis-impaired driving on the bottom. And in both cases, the group that reported engaging in that behavior on some regularity, whether it's monthly or on a at least in the past 6 months, for the case of cannabis use, showed elevated demand relative to people who did not report engaging in this particular high-risk behavior. So it suggests to us that at least at the trait level, when we look at how people generally value alcohol, there appears to be meaningful differences based on whether or not they have an alcohol use disorder, how severe that alcohol use disorder is, as well as whether they're using multiple substances or whether they are reporting that they drive after using substances. But the question that's really been driving my interest over the past, I would say 5 years or so, a little bit longer than that, is what about the context in which somebody consumes substances? So we have to think about the fact that behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context. It happens in a particular environment. And the proximal antecedents of a choice are important to understand if we want to develop meaningful and effective interventions. We need to understand the situations in which somebody might be more or less likely to consume a substance. We need to understand the situations that might increase one's desire or motivation to consume a substance. And so for me, when I think of context, it's really the kind of the W questions, right? So the where are you? When is this occurring? Why are you wanting to consume? Who are you with? What are you doing, right? So all of these things combined constitute your context, right? So what is happening immediately preceding and immediately after substance use? In this case, we're interested in a variety of things. So we could be interested in someone's immediate environment. So where are they? Are they in a social versus a solitary context? Do they have any external contingencies or requirements or responsibilities coming up? We'll talk about those in a moment. It could be your mood or your affective state. Could be whether you are currently intoxicated versus not, as well as do you have other things that you could be doing right now, or is really the only thing available to you at this moment is consuming alcohol or the drug of choice. We ran a meta-analysis. It's been a while now. It's been about 6 years or so, where we looked at these studies that looked at these contextual influences. And the conclusion was that although alcohol demand and other types of demand is generally trait-like, there are a variety of contextual factors that contribute to dynamic within-person fluctuations in demand. So for example, on the left, you'll see two different demand curves from a study by Sam Acuff, where what you're seeing here is people were told to assume that they're drinking in a social setting with other people versus drinking completely by themselves. And people reported, self-report, that they would drink more alcoholic drinks, hypothetically, at these prices if they were drinking with other people relative to when they were by themselves. And then the other slide to the other graph to the right is showing you a study by Max Owens and colleagues that showed that when people are experiencing acute stress, so if you give them a laboratory stress induction, it's more of an affective or a mood state, we have higher demand for alcohol relative to a neutral study. And some of this might be bringing back some memories for Dr. Stoliak, because we both did stress inductions for our dissertations. And so we both sort of know about this line of work around how acute stress is impacting choice. So with that, what we want to think about is an updated contextual model. So that reinforcer pathology model that I told you about a little bit ago has been updated by Sam Acuff and colleagues to include these contextual influences on choice. And so if you're at all interested in this, this was published in 2023 in Nature Reviews Psychology. It's a wonderful paper that walks through the basic tenets of reinforcer pathology, but then takes it a step further and brings in the environment and all of these other contextual factors. I highly recommend taking a glance at this if you're interested in learning more. So with that background in mind, what I want us to do now is walk through 3 different studies or series of studies from my lab. The first one is looking at the effects of alcohol-related cues on demand for alcohol. The second one is going to look at next day responsibilities, and I'll explain what I mean by those, on how people value alcohol and cannabis. And then the last couple studies will just introduce the idea of neuroeconomics and looking at alcohol demand decisions. So the first study is a series of laboratory studies looking at alcohol cue effects on demand for alcohol. So in this case, I want you to think about this room that's shown on the screen. This may not look unlike an assessment room that you have at your university or your research center. It's a pretty typical neutral room where we might do baseline data collection or interviews with participants from the community or from a research participant pool. It's a nice, well-furnished room. It looks nice. There's not really anything on the walls. But as an addictions researcher, I'm less interested in this particular type of a space. because this is not very indicative of where people consume substances. Very rarely do we consume alcohol in what essentially is an office building setting, right? An academic building, very rarely. Instead, people consume in spaces that look maybe something like this. So this is a simulated bar laboratory that we have at the University of Kansas, and there's a handful of these now across the globe of people that have developed these bar lab type settings where we can study decisions about alcohol and other types of processes related to drinking in a more naturalistic drinking environment. So the idea here is, can we temporarily sort of suspend that reality that this person is in a lab, suspend, we're not testing them in a neutral office. Now we're testing them in a bar with alcohol bottles and other stimuli on the walls and beer taps and bar stools and all of these things. I'm not naive to think that participants fully immerse themselves in this environment and don't remember that they're in a lab, but this is, in my opinion, considerably better than testing people in a setting that looks like this, right? So we have a more ecologically valid environment for studying these things. But the question that I have and others have had is, how does being in such an environment influence your desire to drink and your value of alcohol? So this is a study that was published in 2023 by one of my former master's students. Emma Marsden was the lead author on this, where we were interested in what are the effects of alcohol-related cues on demand and craving for alcohol. So what Emma and the team did was we looked at a secondary analysis of data from two other studies. So I was at the time running an fMRI study looking at alcohol demand, and we had baseline data that was collected before any MRI scanning happened. And then my colleague, James McKillop, had a pharmacotherapy trial. Dr. Stoyak, I don't recall if you were around in the lab when we were doing the D-cycloserine study, but that's what this data is from. It's a laboratory study that was looking at a specific pharmacotherapy for craving for alcohol, but the lab data were collected before any medication administration was delivered. So in the top study, we had 117 adult heavy drinkers who consumed more than 14 or 7 drinks per week for men and women, respectively, and they reported at least one heavy drinking episode per week. The study was about 51% female, mean age of around 35 years old, bachelor's education, so post-secondary education with a degree was the median, and then their income was 75 to 90,000 US dollars per year. The study on the bottom, since it was a pharmacotherapy trial, was a little bit of a different sample. They were DSM-5 alcohol or DSM-4 alcohol abuse or dependence. There were 89 individuals, but they were seeking treatment. They were engaged in a pharmacotherapy trial. So slightly different population, which actually I think is a strength, because if we're able to show similar effects in a community-based sample of drinkers and a sample of participants who are seeking treatment for alcohol-related problems, we actually have some nice generalizability. In this particular study, they were around 40% female, 41 years old, some university level education, so 13 to 14 years of education. Their median annual income was about half that of the sample at the top. So somewhat different in terms of their education level and their education, or in their income, excuse me. So what we did in this study was we essentially had people participate in a laboratory cue exposure. This was based on standard procedures for conducting cue exposures that have been around since the late 1980s, where you start with a neutral beverage. So in this case, it's a bottle of water poured into a glass. We pour that water. They listen to a script that asks them to pay attention to the glass. What does it look like? What does it smell like? What would it be like to take a taste of the beverage, etc. Then they do an assessment, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Then they go into the bar lab. So on the picture down here at the bottom is the bar lab at McMaster University. On the bottom right, in this case, we pour their preferred alcoholic beverage. So that's either a beer, a glass of wine, or a mixed liquor drink. They listen to a similar recording that asks them to pay attention to the glass. What does the beverage look like? Is it a cold beverage? What does it smell like? Bring it up to your nose, take deep breaths of the beverage, etc. So we're trying to get both smell, visual, and tactile cues, but it's their preferred alcoholic beverage in this case. So the comparison here is their responses to the alcohol cues in relation to the neutral cues. And what we do is we ask them a series of questions. So the first questions were about alcohol craving. So we would ask either on a 0 to 100 or a 0 to 10, depending on the study, how much do you want to drink? How much do you desire a drink? How much do you crave a drink? And then we compiled those into a composite craving score. And then we also asked questions related to this alcohol purchase task. So it was how many drinks would you consume if they cost a certain amount of money? So they were either free and they went up to, let's say, $20 a drink. And so in terms of the results, the first thing I want to show you is something that's not necessarily surprising, but it was something that we needed to see in this study, which was that in study one on the left, those are our community-based non-treatment seeking heavy drinkers, and the study on the right, which is the treatment seeking heavy drinkers, we see a pronounced increase in their subjective craving for alcohol when they're shown the alcohol cues and their preferred alcoholic beverage relative to the neutral lab space with the water beverage. So again, this is not surprising. This has been well demonstrated since the 1980s, but it's a nice validity check, manipulation check for cue exposure. The next set of figures are demand curves for, again, study one, which is the community drinkers, and study two, which is the treatment seeking heavy drinkers with AUD. The effects aren't particularly large, but you do see that in the case of, in both studies, the alcohol cue demand curve is stacked on top of the neutral cue demand curve. So participants are reporting that they want to consume more drinks when the environment is the bar lab versus when it's the neutral lab. In this case, we also can look at all of those different demand indices that I mentioned earlier. So whether it's intensity, breakpoint, Omax. The take home here is that with the exception of Pmax in the bottom right, we saw statistically significant increases in these demand indices when they were in the alcohol cue environment relative to the neutral cue environment. So they're reporting not just more consumption, but it's translating also into these economic indices of how much they value the substance. So the interim summary for this study is that across two distinct samples, so community drinkers as well as treatment-seeking drinkers with AUD, we see consistent increases in alcohol demand following cues. And I would argue that reinforcing value might be a mechanism for alcohol cue effects. So we know that alcohol cues increase subjective motivation, but that's a little murky. It doesn't always show that. And it could be that reinforcing value provides one mechanism for how people are wanting to consume more because they're overvaluing alcohol when it's in those alcohol cue rich environments. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about two different studies that looked at upcoming responsibilities on alcohol and cannabis demand. So we're still in the context of alcohol demand. We're going to bring cannabis into it here as part of this series of studies, but we're going to shift away from alcohol cues, and now we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities. So the reason that I and others care about roles and responsibilities is that these are deeply embedded in the DSM-5 substance use disorder criteria. So we know that some of the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder are continuing to use substances despite failure to maintain major life roles or responsibilities, such as being a parent or being a caregiver, or you have work-related responsibilities or academic responsibilities. There's also a sort of failure to continue to engage in other activities despite your drinking. So there is this idea that roles and responsibilities or interpersonal problems or difficulties with work or other challenges are a core symptom of alcohol or substance use disorders. A series of studies led by Jim Murphy's lab at the University of Memphis here in the US showed that if we ask people to imagine that they have something important happening the next morning, that they reduce their level of alcohol consumption on these purchase tasks, so their demand goes down. Because Dr. Murphy's lab predominantly has been studying interventions for young adult drinking in college students or university students, his studies predominantly have focused on academic responsibility. So you have class the next morning, or you have an exam in your class the next morning. And so what his data suggests is, if you look at this demand curve, we have three different curves plotted here. In the diamonds, we have no responsibility. So participants said they would drink around 10 to 11 drinks if they were free, if they didn't have anything specific the next day. But if they have a class, or if they have a test the next morning, if they're told to assume that, their level of consumption goes down in an orderly fashion. It appears that the test, the next day exam, is a particularly salient contextual factor for their consumption. So if I have a test the next day, I'm cutting my consumption almost close to about more than half, about 2/3 of what I would normally consume if I didn't have that. So my lab got interested in this work because we started to think more broadly than just university students and academic responsibilities. And Brandon Miller, one of my current doctoral students, led a project as part of one of my ongoing studies where we wanted to extend this in two specific ways. The first way was to think about extending beyond a sample of university students. So we wanted to get community adult drinkers if we could. And we also wanted to think about responsibilities more broadly. So it certainly is valuable to think about academic related responsibilities for university students, but if I'm a 45-year-old man or woman in the community, I'm not going to class and I don't have exams. So how might the responsibilities that those people have to manage and navigate differ from university level students? In this case, we recruited 261 participants from an online crowdsourcing platform called Amazon Mechanical Turk. We applied a bunch of attention checks and data validity checks, so we're fairly confident that these 261 participants are engaged, providing valid data, etc. They were on average around 38 years old and 60% male. The first thing we were worried about is, did we do a sufficient job of getting a non-student community-based sample? And I think the data presented here illustrate that that is the case. So 92% of this sample reported they were employed, at least part-time, but majority of them were employed full-time. 88% were not currently enrolled in any sort of an academic program. 50% had children or dependents that they were responsible for, and 24% were responsible for providing care for another individual who was not a child. So those 2 points are going to be relevant when we think about how the purchase task scenarios work. So we asked people first to rank order these 8 responsibilities. This obviously is not the entire spectrum of responsibilities that somebody may have to engage in, but this is sort of our starting point. So we had going to work, having a job interview, taking care of your kids, maybe it's community volunteering, and then we wanted some more leisure-based things, so participating in a group fitness class or going to the gym with another person, just to sprinkle those in. And then what they did is they did a alcohol purchase task when there was no specific responsibility the next day. And then they did a responsibility purchase task where they were told to imagine they have something the next morning. So in this case, you have work early in the morning tomorrow. Over this 5-hour period the night before, how many alcoholic drinks would you consume at the following prices? And that's in comparison to the no responsibility purchase task, which is imagine you don't have any obligations the next morning. So just a typical evening in which you might drink alcohol, but you don't have class, you don't have work, you don't have to take care of your kids, whatever it may be. So because they rank ordered their top choices, the sample sizes for the different responsibilities are going to be slightly different because it's based on their rankings. But this is some of the take-home data to think about. So these are demand curves as a function of the responsibility type. So we have work, I'll explain work extra in a moment, a job interview, caring for your family or caring for your kids. So the caring for children was specifically dependents that you are responsible for. Caring for family was maybe you're responsible for caring for a sibling or a parent or somebody else. Okay. In this case, the filled circles is the responsibility, filled squares is the responsibility condition. and the unfilled data points are the no responsibility condition. And it was encouraging to see that across all of these different responsibility categories, it appears that the responsibility condition suppressed demand relative to the no responsibility condition. In this case, it also appears that maybe something like a job interview or having this work extra. So work extra for us was you don't just have work, but you have to give a presentation or you have to lead a meeting. So it's a bit higher stakes than just going into the office in the morning or doing remote work in the morning. They all seem to be suppressing demand. This wasn't a particularly civically engaged group, so only 12 of our participants said that volunteering was one of their top 2 activities. And then group fitness and gym with a friend were relatively low endorsement as well. So the error bars are quite large in this case, but the general pattern does seem to hold that with the responsibility is there, they're reporting less consumption, lower demand relative to when it is a no responsibility condition. So I want to skip forward and jump to an extension of this study to cannabis use. So far, all we've been talking about is alcohol-related purchase tasks. We're going to shift and talk about cannabis for a moment. And this study is published in the Journal of Experimental Analysis Behavior is a really exciting project for my lab because everybody that you see here is part of the authorship team. And this paper included a couple of my undergraduate students as well who made a lot of contributions to this paper. So Christina Chen and Anna Lester were included as co-authors on this. And so this paper really did span undergrads all the way through grad students, a postdoc, and a faculty member. So I'm really proud of this paper. We did a slightly different approach here. We used a crowdsourcing platform known as Prolific instead of Amazon MTurk. We recruited 177 participants who reported consuming cannabis on a regular basis, 47% women and around 37 years old. They did a marijuana purchase task in this case, where you're asking consumption of cannabis products as a function of price for either a no responsibility condition or 5 of those responsibilities from the previous study. In the case of the marijuana purchase task, we're asking people to consume hits of cannabis. Different versions of this task might use grams or joints, but for a state-based task, we typically use individual hits or puffs of a joint. And what we found in this study that was really interesting to me was that we also saw similar reductions in the consumption as a function of the responsibility. So in this case, the filled circles are the no responsibility condition, and the unfilled circles are the responsibility condition. We see a suppression in consumption when people are told to assume that they have this activity coming up in the next morning. Something that's unique about cannabis relative to alcohol, though, is that the time course and the pharmacology of cannabis effects may not lead to impairment the next morning. So some of our participants in qualitative feedback said, well, I actually wouldn't be impaired the next morning if I smoked cannabis the night before because it'll wear off. It's not the same as alcohol, where if I have a particularly heavy drinking episode, I might be feeling some hangover related or acute withdrawal symptoms the next morning. That's not going to usually be the case for cannabis. So as part of this study, my former postdoc, Dr. Sarah Weinstock, is doing a series of studies where she's looking at how suitable cannabis or alcohol use is with different activities. So we ask people, how suitable is it to consume cannabis while you have to go to work the next morning or take care of your kids or whatever it may be? And we ask them this with a simple multiple choice question, and we can bin participants into just essentially whether they said it was suitable or whether they said it was unsuitable. And this is actually a really interesting finding, I think, because these are the same demand curves, but what we've done now is broken it up into whether or not the participants, based on their own opinion, view cannabis use as suitable with that activity versus not. And what you can see is the green columns for each of these. There's still a decrease, but it's a relatively modest decrease relative to the unsuitable. So if I'm a person who says it's completely unsuitable or somewhat unsuitable, incompatible, if you will, cannabis use with this activity, my demand essentially flatlines. An interesting one is on the right side, the middle row, the caring for kids. So if I'm somebody that says that cannabis use is completely incompatible or unsuitable with that, my consumption essentially goes flatline. That's more or less zero consumption for these participants. Whereas if they're saying it's suitable, it won't affect me, they're still willing to consume about 15 hits in the case of caring for kids. So the interim summary for this part is essentially that a range of responsibilities across multiple studies are showing decreased demand for alcohol and cannabis, and that the largest decreases appear to be for work-related or caregiving activities in these non-student participants. But the suitability results suggest that there really are these important individual differences that we might need to be aware of when we're designing interventions. So if all we did was present a group level mean, which was the first set of figures I showed you for cannabis, we would conclude that these responsibilities reduce demand essentially uniformly. But it's not the case. It's only in a certain group of people that view it as unsuitable that it really does suppress demand. But in people that say, well, it's not that inconsistent with me having to go to work in the morning or take care of my kids or whatever it may be, they don't suppress as much. So when we think about continuing to consume substances despite failure to maintain major roles and obligations or problems with family or problems with work, this might be one of the reasons why the participants are not viewing it as incompatible and are continuing to consume, even though it's leading to potential negative outcomes for them. So in the third and final part of what I want to talk about today, I want to shift gears and move out from the lab and move into more of a neuroscience context here, where we're going to think about neuroeconomics. So neuroeconomics essentially is taking behavioral economics and bringing neuroscience and neurobiology into the equation. So in this case, we often are using sophisticated brain imaging techniques like functional MRI or other techniques. In the case of my lab, we use functional MRI for this type of work. And I was fortunate to be part of a study when I was in graduate school where we were the first to take these purchase tasks and put them into the scanner. So what we did is we had a group of heavy drinking men answer these types of questions. How many drinks would you consume if they cost a certain amount of money, while we're collecting functional MRI data while they're making these choices? And we were able to show that there was this distributed network of brain regions, including striatum and insula, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, as well as some posterior parietal areas that were showed blood oxygen level dependent bold signal increases when they were making these choices relative to rest. So then that led me to ask an interesting set of questions, which was, what happens if we put some of these contextual manipulations into the equation? So this was a study that we just completed. It's an R01 funded by NIAAA here in the US, where we were interested in conducting two studies where we asked what was the effect of alcohol-related cues, and then what is the effect of next-day responsibilities on the neural correlates of making these choices in a sample of heavy drinkers. So the first study is published in Psychiatry Research Neuroimaging, and we essentially adapted the purchase task to look something like this. So they have a number line and they have button boxes, and they indicate their choice by moving a green box to the left and the right. And then it allows us to generate a demand curve that we break the demand curve up into different phases: inelastic, elastic, and suppressed. The methods for study one were fairly straightforward. We obviously don't have a bar lab in the MRI environment, but we can present people with alcohol-related stimuli, so pictures of their preferred alcoholic beverage relative to a water image. And so they did blocks of these cues followed by purchase task blocks. What we found in 72 heavy drinkers was that it was a modest increase, but we did see this cue effect in terms of the consumption. So they reported they would consume slightly more drinks when they were in the alcohol cue condition relative to the neutral cue condition. And this also translated into the demand indices with some relatively impressive effect sizes here for higher demand in the alcohol condition relative to the neutral condition. I'm just going to show you briefly some of the fMRI results. On the top, we have neutral cues. On the bottom, we have alcohol cues. We really are most interested in the orange or the more warm colors here. We see activation in that distributed network that I told you about. So we see posterior parietal cortex, we see bilateral insula, we see some dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. What was interesting is we didn't really see a cue effect that we would have expected. And this was largely, I think, driven by the fact that we didn't counterbalance the order. In retrospect, we should have counterbalanced the order. But in laboratory studies, we show neutral cues first, followed by alcohol cues. In terms of the brain activation, turns out that's not the most effective way to design these types of studies. So the cue effect wasn't quite what we were expecting. But we did see an interesting effect based on the type of choice. So if we use sort of a traffic light analogy, the inelastic choices are when the gas is on full speed, there's no brakes being applied. Suppressed is on the far end when they're not consuming anything and the brakes are fully applied. And then we have this middle phase of sort of yellow light or orange light where they're sort of starting to slow down their drinking, but they're still consuming some. And what we found was that across all these regions, particularly dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and insula, we see greater activation in these intermediate choices where essentially price and motivation are in highest conflict. So that was pretty interesting to see. Study 2, which is in prep right now, and I just have a couple of slides just to show you those results that we have in terms of the initial findings. In this case, we want you to imagine an event when you would drink alcohol, but you have a job interview the next morning. And so this is Kiana Soli. She was the project coordinator for this study and is one of the authors on the paper. She's a graduate student in my lab. And in this case, we chose job interview because it had one of the largest effect sizes, and it's a particularly salient event. In this case, we have nothing specific planned the next morning was the control condition. So it's a typical evening in which you might drink alcohol. In half of the choices, you have a job interview the next morning, and the other half of the choices, you have nothing specific. We do 4 total purchase tasks. In this case, we learned our lesson from study 1. We counterbalanced the order of these, and we recruited a total of 47 heavy drinkers for this study, around 38 years old, and 74% of them met DSM-5 criteria for alcohol use disorder, and they consumed on average 24 standard drinks per week. So a relatively heavy drinking sample. In this case, we see a much more pronounced behavioral effect. So this is replicating those behavioral findings I showed you earlier, that when there's no responsibility, so the gray bars or the gray data points, they're consuming about 7 to 8 drinks. And then when we apply a responsibility, their consumption goes down, their break point goes down, and their Omax goes down as well. In this case, though, the last bit of results I want to share, we do see something very interesting. So we have some regions of interest highlighted here. So bilateral insula and striatum on the top left, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and precuneus, and then supplementary motor area across the top, and then the corresponding activation levels in the responsibility condition. In this case, what we found was that when people had that responsibility in play, so they had that job interview the next morning, they're showing a suppression of bold signal in these regions. So dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and insula in particular showed some of the larger effect sizes here. So think of it this way. When I don't have any specific things happening the next day, I don't have to keep my drinking in check in any way. I don't have that external contingency. So I don't need to augment, or my brain processing does not need to augment in any way to account for that. But when I have a responsibility happening and there's something where I need to be sort of moderating my drinking, some of these regions, such as higher cortical areas or even insula, which is involved in sort of integrating visceral urges into motivated choice, we see a suppression and activation in those regions. It is, we don't have the spatial resolution to really look at timing here, but it does suggest that there is at least a neural difference between when people are making these choices when it's no responsibility versus responsibility. So just to summarize and wrap up, I hope I've convinced you today that behavioral economics is an interesting and useful framework for studying choice in the context of addiction and other mental health disorders as we extend it beyond addiction. I hope I've also convinced you that context matters. So that context could be whether or not you're in the presence of alcohol-related cues, whether you have work the next day, whether you have caregiving responsibilities, whatever that context may be. It appears to influence your decisions about drinking and whether or not you continue to consume in those situations, but not for everybody. Some people still continue to consume despite those things. And then just gave you a little bit of a taste of the work that I'm doing in terms of the underlying neural processes of these types of decisions. So with that, I'll just acknowledge the many collaborators I have on this research and the funding support. And with that, I thank you, and I'm more than happy to answer questions with the time that we have remaining, and I can also stay over for a couple of minutes if there's questions. Thank you very much.